The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow over Highland Park. Underneath the towering trees and the rustling leaves, a man named David Grant sat alone on a park bench, engrossed in a book. He loved this time of day, the quiet of the park giving him a much-needed escape from the weight of his daily responsibilities. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment to take it all in, the laughter of children in the distance, the soft chatter of people passing by, and the sense of calm that had been so rare for him lately. Across the park, Officer Jack Rayner strolled with his hand resting comfortably on his baton, his gaze shifting from one person to the next as he scanned the scene. Jack had been a patrol officer in this area for years, and his instinct for spotting trouble was something he'd come to trust implicitly. He knew every inch of this park, and today something caught his eye. David was alone, calm, focused. Too calm, Jack thought, with a suspicious look that wouldn't go unnoticed. From a distance, David felt the weight of someone's gaze on him. Looking up, he noticed the officer's eyes locked on him. David's shoulders tensed slightly, but he didn't break his steady gaze, aware that any reaction might be taken the wrong way. He'd been in situations like this before. He could practically predict how it would go, down to the words exchanged. But today, he felt an unusual mix of annoyance and exhaustion. He held his book a little tighter, unwilling to let this encounter ruin the few moments of peace he'd managed to steal. As Jack approached, he tightened his grip on his baton, unsettled by David's composure. "Afternoon," Jack said, his voice polite but edged with tension. David nodded. "Good afternoon, officer," keeping his tone neutral but friendly, his hands resting visibly on the book. He knew the drill all too well, but he wasn't about to let himself be intimidated. Jack, still uneasy, glanced down at the book before back at David. "What brings you out here?" he asked, though the question felt more like a challenge. David forced a small smile, just enjoying the park. "It's a beautiful day." But even as he answered, he could see Jack's suspicion only deepening, his eyes darting over David as if looking for something hidden. The unspoken tension grew, each man silently daring the other to make the next move. Jack shifted his stance, his tone now more direct. "I haven't seen you around here before," he pressed, as if that fact alone could raise alarms. David held back a sigh, trying to keep his frustration in check. "Well," he replied, carefully choosing his words, "I've been around, officer." But the response only seemed to stoke Jack's suspicion. The silence that followed was thick, each man locked in an unspoken battle of wills. Finally, Jack couldn't hold back any longer, demanding, "Let's see some ID." David's smile faded as he considered his options. He knew he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting on a park bench, but refusing could quickly escalate things. He took a measured breath, looking the officer squarely in the eye. "Am I under arrest?" David asked, his voice calm, but with an unmistakable edge. The question caught Jack off guard. He hadn't expected David to push back, and the calm confidence in David's gaze felt like a challenge he wasn't prepared for. But Jack wasn't one to back down. With a slightly raised voice, he shot back, "You will be if you don't cooperate." His hand moved to his holster, a clear threat meant to assert control, but David didn't flinch. He met Jack's gaze steadily, his hands still visible, his voice low and even. "Officer, I'm just sitting here reading. Is there a law against that?" Jack's patience was wearing thin. He was determined not to let this encounter slip from his control, but even he knew his excuse was flimsy at best. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. He stepped closer, his posture growing more confrontational, looming over David as if to force a reaction. David, however, didn't move. He kept his eyes on Jack, refusing to give him the satisfaction of backing down. "And what description is that, officer?" David asked, his tone quiet, his gaze unwavering. The question landed like a slap. Jack could feel his jaw tighten as he struggled for a response. He hadn't expected David to remain so calm, so in control of himself, and it was unnerving. This was supposed to be routine, but something about this man was shaking him, challenging the very instincts he'd relied on for years. But he wasn't about to show weakness. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, his hand inching closer to his holster. Show me some ID now." The two men locked eyes, the tension between them almost palpable, each daring the other to make the next move. David could see where this was going and decided to comply, at least for now. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, to make sure Jack saw every move, pulling out his wallet with calm precision. Jack watched him like a hawk, ready to react at the slightest hint of aggression, his body coiled like a spring. When David handed over his ID, Jack snatched it from his hand without a word, his gaze dropping to the name on the card. He didn't recognize the name, but that didn't matter. Jack had already made up his mind. "Stand up," he ordered, stepping back to give David room. There was no turning back now. He was too far in to admit he might have been wrong. David felt a surge of frustration rise within him, but pushed it down. Slowly, he stood, his hands visible, giving Jack no reason to feel threatened. "Turn around," Jack said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. David knew this was a power move, a flex meant to reinforce control, but he wasn't about to give Jack the reaction he wanted. Without resistance, David turned, feeling the cold metal close around his wrists as Jack tightened the cuffs. He could feel the eyes of passers-by on him, could sense their judgment, but he stayed calm, reminding himself who he was and what this officer would soon find out. As Jack led David toward the patrol car, the world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them locked in a silent struggle. David's wrists ached under the pressure of the cuffs, but he kept his face impassive, refusing to give Jack the satisfaction of seeing any discomfort. The walk was slow, almost deliberate, as if Jack was savoring the control he thought he had over the situation. But David's mind was already shifting to what would come next. Once at the car, Jack opened the door, guiding David into the back seat. David settled in, his eyes following the trees and park benches slipping away through the window as they drove toward the precinct. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself, reminding himself that he'd been through worse and that this, too, would pass. Yet, despite his calm exterior, a subtle but growing feeling of weariness gnawed at him, an exhaustion that went far beyond this single encounter. Jack, meanwhile, kept glancing at David through the rearview mirror. Every time their eyes met, a ripple of something unfamiliar stirred within him. Doubt, maybe, or something he wasn't yet willing to name. Jack had been a cop for years, but today, for some reason, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping from his control. David's calm, unflinching gaze had unnerved him more than he cared to admit, and he found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter with each passing minute. As they neared the precinct, Jack glanced over at David's ID one more time, the name still not meaning anything to him, but his pride wouldn't let him admit he might have been mistaken. Instead, he mumbled to himself, "What were you really doing in that park anyway?" He cast a sideways look at David in the mirror, suspicion edging his voice. David met his gaze, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I told you, officer," he replied, his tone polite but with a faint trace of irony. "I was reading." Jack scoffed, shaking his head. "Reading, right? A guy like you just reading in the park? Come on. Do you expect me to believe that?" But even as he spoke, he could hear how hollow it sounded. He was clinging to an assumption, refusing to let go. David raised an eyebrow, letting the silence stretch out between them, forcing Jack to confront the absurdity of his own words. Moments later, they arrived at the precinct. Jack parked the car and helped David out, his grip on David's arm firmer than it needed to be, as if clinging to the last shred of control he still had. Inside, the precinct was buzzing with the usual activity. Officers filling out reports, phones ringing, the hum of conversations filling the air. But as Jack led David through the hall, a few heads turned, eyebrows raising at the sight of David in cuffs. Some officers exchanged glances, recognizing something off about the scene, though none said anything just yet. When they reached the processing desk, Officer Jenkins, a younger officer with a sharp gaze and quick reflexes, looked up from his computer, his eyes flicking between Jack and David. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone neutral but curious. Jack cleared his throat, standing a little straighter. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," he said, handing over David's ID with a firm, if slightly strained voice. Jenkins took the ID, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as he glanced down at the name. In that brief, almost invisible flicker of recognition, David knew someone here understood who he was. Jenkins masked his surprise quickly, but not quickly enough to go unnoticed by David, who filed it away in his mind. "Captain Morgan's in her office," Jenkins said, handing the ID back to Jack. "You'll need to take him to her." Jack's confidence faltered for a split second. He hadn't planned on involving the captain so soon, but he had no choice. Nodding curtly, he gripped David's arm a little tighter. "All right," he muttered, "let's go." David walked beside Jack, his steps steady, his expression unreadable, though inwardly he took some satisfaction in seeing Jack's growing uncertainty. When they reached Captain Morgan's office, Jack knocked, and they heard her voice from inside, inviting them in. Captain Morgan, a seasoned officer known for her strict sense of fairness, looked up from her desk as they entered. Her gaze shifted from Jack to David, and in that split second, David saw a flicker of recognition, one that she expertly hid behind a neutral expression. "Officer Rayner," she said, her tone even. "What brings you here?" Jack straightened up, guiding David into the room. "Caught this guy acting suspicious in the park, Captain. He wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Morgan's gaze moved to David, her expression unreadable. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice calm, but with a faint hint of something David couldn't quite place. He could tell she was measuring her words carefully, waiting to see how Jack would handle the situation. "That's right, Captain," Jack continued, oblivious to the silent exchange between Morgan and David. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Morgan nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she turned her attention back to Jack. "And did you have probable cause for this arrest, Officer Rayner?" Her tone was polite, but there was an undercurrent of sternness that made Jack hesitate, as if sensing the ground beneath him starting to shift. "He wouldn't cooperate, Captain," Jack repeated, though his voice lacked the certainty it held before. "He was evasive." Morgan studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp. "Evasive, you say?" She looked back at David, who was watching the exchange with quiet patience. "Mind if I speak with Mr. Grant alone, Officer Rayner?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for argument. Jack blinked, clearly taken aback by the request, but Captain Morgan's expression was firm. Reluctantly, he released David and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Captain Morgan's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice calm, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." David allowed himself a small, polite smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Captain Morgan sighed, casting a glance at the closed door. "I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate it if we could keep that information private for the time being. I need to handle this situation carefully." David nodded, understanding the position she was in. "Of course," he replied, his tone respectful. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain, just to make sure things are handled appropriately." She nodded back, relief mingling with a subtle sense of tension. She leaned forward, studying David's face with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "May I ask," she said, "why you didn't just tell Officer Rayner who you are?" David's polite smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain," he said quietly. "My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect." Captain Morgan held his gaze, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. She nodded slowly. "You're right," she said softly. "It shouldn't matter, but unfortunately, it does to some people." There was a brief pause, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavily in the room. Finally, she straightened, her expression turning professional once more. "I'll call Officer Rayner back in, and we'll resolve this," she said firmly. David nodded, watching as she moved to open the door. Jack re-entered, a wary expression on his face as he sensed the shift in atmosphere. Captain Morgan addressed him with a steely gaze, one that demanded attention. "Officer Rayner," she began, her tone calm, but carrying an undeniable edge, "Mr. Grant is not the man you were looking for. You'll release him immediately." Jack's eyes widened in shock, the weight of her words sinking in, but he hesitated, pride still holding him back. "But, Captain," he began, scrambling for some justification, some excuse, but her expression brooked no argument. Immediately, Officer Rayner, she repeated, her voice firm. There was no room for defiance, and Jack knew it. With a defeated sigh, he reached for the keys, unlocking David's handcuffs with hands that trembled slightly as he realized the extent of his mistake. The cuffs clicked open, and David rubbed his wrists, giving Jack a measured look. "Thank you, officer," he said, his tone polite but carrying an unmistakable undertone of finality. Jack swallowed, his pride bruised, his sense of control shattered. "You're free to go," he muttered, barely meeting David's eyes. David nodded, turning to Captain Morgan, who gave him a respectful nod. "I'll be in touch, Captain," David said quietly, his words carrying a weight that both officers understood. As David walked out of the office, Jack was left standing there, the gravity of what he'd done pressing down on him like a heavy weight. When he finally sank into his chair, his mind racing, he knew his life would never quite be the same. As David left the precinct, he took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs as he felt the familiar weight of freedom settle back onto his shoulders. But behind him, Jack sat at his desk, unable to shake the sense of dread creeping into his thoughts. His mind raced, replaying every second of their encounter in the park, every choice he'd made. For the first time in years, he felt something unsettling tugging at his confidence, a gnawing doubt that he'd made a grave mistake. He wanted to push the thoughts aside, but his pride had cracked, and each memory of David's calm, resolute stare only deepened his discomfort. Captain Morgan's voice echoed in his head, her authoritative tone still fresh in his memory. He stared at his hands, flexing them as if to shake off the feeling of those handcuffs. For the first time, he wondered how it had felt for David. In the hours that followed, Jack found himself unable to concentrate on anything else. His colleagues moved around him, but he barely registered their presence. He kept hearing David's calm words, "Is there a law against that?" And each replay was a reminder of how he'd lost control. Finally, as evening fell, Jack received a summons to Captain Morgan's office. The walk felt longer than usual, his mind buzzing with anticipation and an underlying fear he hadn't felt since his early days as a rookie. He entered her office, where she sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable but serious. "Sit down, Officer Rayner," she said, her tone calm but with an edge that made his palms sweat. He took a seat, barely able to meet her gaze, sensing that whatever she was about to say wouldn't be pleasant. "Officer Rayner," she began, leaning forward with a stern expression, "I want to make one thing very clear. Your actions today have put this precinct and this department in an incredibly difficult position." Jack felt his stomach twist, but he nodded, trying to stay composed. She continued, "David Grant is not just anyone. He's someone with influence, and more than that, he's someone who's committed to holding officers accountable. I'm not sure if you understand the full scope of what that means." Jack tried to speak, but his words faltered. He was used to handling tough situations, but this one had slipped through his fingers, and he could feel the consequences closing in on him. Captain Morgan's gaze softened, if only slightly, as she studied his face. "Jack," she said, her tone shifting, "this isn't just about today. This is about a pattern of behavior I've noticed over time, a pattern that needs to change." The words hit him harder than he expected. He'd always taken pride in his instincts, his so-called ability to read people, but hearing her say it so plainly, calling it a pattern, made him realize that he'd crossed a line without even knowing it. He started, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Let me finish," she said firmly. "I know you're a good officer, Jack, but sometimes good officers make mistakes. And the difference between those who grow and those who stay stuck in their ways is how they respond when they're forced to confront the truth." Her words were blunt, but they were also oddly compassionate, as if she were giving him a chance to redeem himself. "Captain," Jack said slowly, his voice almost a whisper, "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was following my instincts, protecting the community." She nodded, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "But do you understand now, Jack, that your instincts, your gut feeling, can be wrong? That sometimes they're influenced by things you don't want to admit, by assumptions you may not even be aware of?" She let her words hang in the air, and Jack felt the weight of them settle over him, a strange mixture of shame and relief. She wasn't dismissing him outright. She was giving him a chance to look deeper, to understand where he'd gone wrong. After a long silence, he nodded. I see that now, Captain, he replied, his voice strained. I think I've been relying on my instincts so much, I forgot to question them. I've forgotten that those instincts can be biased. The admission felt like a stone dropping from his chest. Heavy and uncomfortable, but necessary. Captain Morgan regarded him with a serious expression. Jack, there's going to be an official review of this incident. And during that time, you'll be placed on temporary leave. I want you to use this time wisely. Reflect on what you've done, why you made the choices you did, and consider how you can move forward differently. Do you understand? He nodded again, feeling a growing resolve within him. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, to confront the things he'd been avoiding for so long. As he left her office, he felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, guilt, and something close to hope. It was a humbling experience, but one that felt like it had the potential to change everything if he was willing to do the work. The next morning, Jack sat alone in his living room, replaying the events over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of David's face, the calm, composed way he'd handled the situation. It struck Jack how different they were. He'd always seen himself as the one in control, the one with authority. Yet in those moments, it was David who had shown true strength. The realization was both unsettling and humbling. With a newfound determination, Jack decided to reach out for support. He enrolled in an implicit bias training course, something he'd heard about but had always shrugged off. He couldn't ignore it anymore. If he was going to make a change, he had to start somewhere. The classes were eye-opening, forcing him to confront aspects of himself he'd been unwilling to face. Meanwhile, word of the incident had started to spread through the precinct and beyond. Some officers saw it as a wake-up call, a reminder that even small assumptions could have major consequences. Others were resistant, unwilling to acknowledge that such biases could exist within their ranks. The tension was palpable, a mix of denial, defensiveness, and reflection that left everyone on edge. One afternoon, just as Jack was beginning to feel the weight of his decisions settling over him, he received an unexpected message. It was from David Grant. The message was short but to the point. I'd like to meet. Jack's heart raced as he read the words. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew he couldn't pass up the opportunity. They arranged to meet in the same park where everything had unfolded, a place that now held a deeper, almost symbolic weight for both of them. When Jack arrived, he found David waiting on the same bench, his posture relaxed as he watched the world go by. As Jack approached, David looked up, his gaze calm but curious. Jack nodded in greeting, feeling a mix of nervousness and gratitude. David, Jack started, unsure of how to begin. I just wanted to say thank you for meeting with me. I wasn't expecting. David raised a hand, stopping him. Let's skip the formalities, Jack, he said, his voice calm but direct. I didn't ask you to meet me here to hear apologies or excuses. I asked you here because I think we both need to understand each other better. Jack swallowed, nodding slowly. I think you're right, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. David gestured to the bench, inviting him to sit. Jack took a seat beside him, feeling an odd mix of tension and relief. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching the people around them, the laughter of children, the distant sound of a dog barking. It was a peaceful scene, one that felt strangely surreal given the intensity of their last encounter. After a long pause, David spoke. Jack, I want you to know something, he began, his tone calm but serious. I didn't stay calm that day because I wasn't affected. I stayed calm because I knew I had to. Because for me, losing control could mean losing everything. Do you understand what that's like? Jack felt his throat tighten as he processed David's words. He nodded, but he knew he couldn't truly understand. Not fully. I can't imagine, he said quietly. But I want to understand. David studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. It's a start, he replied. But understanding means facing things that might make you uncomfortable. It means looking at the ways you've been taught to see people like me, the ways you've been taught to react. Jack's gaze dropped, and he nodded, feeling the weight of David's words settle over him. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to change." David's expression softened slightly, and he nodded. "That's all anyone can ask, Jack," he said. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But if you're willing to put in the work, to really question the things you believed, then maybe this experience can be something more than just a mistake. Maybe it can be a step towards something better." They sat in silence again, each man lost in his own thoughts, but with a newfound sense of understanding. Jack felt an unfamiliar but profound sense of gratitude. He hadn't expected this meeting to unfold this way, hadn't expected David to show such grace. It was a humbling experience, one that he knew would stay with him long. After this conversation was over, and as they sat there, side by side, two men who had once been on opposite sides of a fraud encounter, they found a common ground, a shared commitment to moving forward, not just as individuals, but as part of something larger. For Jack, it was the beginning of a new path, one that would require him to confront his own flaws, his own biases, and to rebuild his sense of purpose from the ground up. And for David, it was a chance to see a glimmer of hope, to believe that change, though slow and often painful, was still possible. The park around them was quiet now, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the scene. And in that moment, both men understood that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey, one that they would each have to walk, but one that they no longer had to walk alone. Days after their meeting in the park, Jack found himself replaying David's words in his mind, a newfound clarity settling over him. But it wasn't just David's words that lingered. It was the way he'd looked at him, with a blend of stern honesty and empathy. Jack had never expected to feel so exposed, yet somehow seen, as if David understood him in ways he didn't yet understand himself. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the fallout from the incident continued to ripple through the department. Officers whispered in hushed tones, some casting wary glances at Jack, while others took a more supportive stance. It was clear the incident had hit a nerve, and the department was facing growing pressure to address its approach to policing. Captain Morgan, ever the resolute leader, called for a department-wide review of policies on de-escalation and bias training. This move sparked heated discussions among officers, some embracing the changes, others feeling their authority was under threat. One afternoon, as Jack sat at home going over materials from his bias training course, he received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was calm but firm, with an air of authority that immediately caught his attention. "Officer Rayner," the voice began, "my name is Agent Samuel Knox. I'm reaching out from the Bureau. I believe you had an encounter recently with one of our own, Special Agent David Grant." The name alone made Jack's heart skip a beat, but he forced himself to listen, his grip on the phone tightening as Agent Knox continued. "We'd like you to come in for a meeting," Agent Knox said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. "We believe there's value in discussing this incident further. It's not every day that a local officer finds himself in a unique situation like this. Let's say there's an opportunity here for both you and the Bureau." The message was cryptic, but Jack agreed, his mind racing. The next day, Jack arrived at the federal building, feeling an uneasy blend of anxiety and curiosity. As he walked down the hall, he couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. He was led to a conference room, where Agent Knox and another official were seated. David was there too, his calm demeanor unshaken, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority. "Officer Rayner," Agent Knox greeted him, extending a hand. Jack shook it, feeling the firm grip, a silent assertion of control. "Thank you for coming," Knox said, gesturing for him to sit. "You may wonder why you're here." Jack nodded, his nerves on edge. "Yes, sir," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Knox leaned forward, studying him with a keen eye. "We're not here to punish you, Officer Rayner," he said slowly, "though I'm sure you've already faced plenty of consequences." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "What we're interested in is what comes next. How we can learn from this incident, not just as individuals, but as institutions." Jack glanced at David, who gave him a small nod, as if encouraging him to listen. The room was silent for a moment as Jack processed Knox's words. You see, Knox continued, his tone thoughtful. This incident has stirred up discussions not just here, but across various agencies. It's a rare opportunity to look at ourselves, our biases, and our processes. We want to explore the possibility of starting an interagency task force focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement. And, Officer Rayner, we think you might have something valuable to contribute. Jack's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. He'd expected a reprimand, not an invitation. Me? He asked, struggling to keep the surprise out of his voice. Why me? David spoke up, his tone steady but firm. Because, Jack, you're at a turning point. You've seen firsthand the impact of unchecked assumptions. And you're willing to face it, which is more than many people can say. We need voices like yours, people who can speak from experience, who've been through the fire and come out willing to change. Jack felt a swell of conflicting emotions, the weight of his past mistakes pressing on him. But beneath the shame was something else, a flicker of purpose. He looked from David to Agent Knox, seeing the quiet but powerful determination in their eyes. This wasn't a handout. It was a challenge, a chance to prove himself in a way he'd never imagined. Taking a deep breath, Jack nodded, his voice steady. I'd be honored, sir, he said, meeting Knox's gaze with newfound resolve. Knox smiled, a rare expression of approval breaking his otherwise stern demeanor. Good, he said, clasping his hands together. Then let's get to work. In the weeks that followed, Jack found himself diving into the task force's efforts with a renewed sense of purpose. He attended training sessions and workshops, often sitting beside other officers and agents who had, like him, been forced to confront their biases. The experience was humbling, often uncomfortable, but it felt right. And through it all, David was there, guiding the discussions with a calm authority that Jack had come to admire deeply. One evening, after a particularly intense training session, Jack and David found themselves alone in the parking lot, the last to leave. The conversation that had begun as small talk soon grew more personal, each man sharing glimpses of their lives that they'd kept hidden from others. David spoke of his years with the Bureau, the challenges he'd faced, the subtle and sometimes blatant discrimination he'd encountered even within his own agency. Jack listened, his respect for David deepening with every word. I never realized, he admitted quietly, just how much you and people like you go through every day. It's humbling, to say the least. David nodded, a faint smile on his lips. And that's all we're asking for, Jack. Not perfection, not a complete overhaul overnight. Just a willingness to see things from a different perspective, to admit when you're wrong, and to work towards something better. Jack felt a strange sense of gratitude. He'd expected this journey to be isolating, to leave him stranded in a sea of guilt and regret. But instead, he'd found an ally, someone who understood his struggles, who was willing to guide him forward. He looked at David, feeling a surge of appreciation. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, for giving me this chance, for not giving up on me when you had every right to. David's gaze softened, and he gave Jack a reassuring nod. We're all a work in progress, Jack. And as long as you're willing to keep learning, to keep pushing yourself, you'll find that there's always a way forward. As they stood there in the fading light, a quiet understanding passed between them. For Jack, it was a moment of profound realization, a promise to himself that he would do better, not just for his own sake, but for the countless others who, like David, had endured the consequences of bias and prejudice. Months passed, and the task force began to make waves, not just within Jack's precinct but throughout the city and beyond. Word of their work spread, and other departments expressed interest in adopting similar initiatives. Jack found himself speaking at events, sharing his story with humility and honesty, no longer hiding from his past mistakes, but embracing them as lessons he could pass on to others. At one such event, he looked out over the crowd, his eyes catching sight of David, who stood at the back, watching with an approving nod. Jack took a deep breath, feeling a sense of gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. He began to speak, his voice steady, filled with the conviction he'd once thought he'd lost. Every one of us, he said, has a choice. We can ignore our biases, let them guide us without question, or we can face them, admit to them, and make the decision to change. It's not an easy path. It's uncomfortable, it's humbling, and sometimes it feels like an uphill battle. But if we're willing to do the work to keep pushing ourselves towards something better, then maybe, just maybe, we can start to rebuild the trust that's been broken. The crowd was silent, each person absorbing his words. And in that silence, Jack felt a deep sense of purpose, a realization that this was where he was meant to be, not as a man without flaws, but as someone willing to confront them. After the event, David approached him, a rare smile breaking through his usual calm demeanor. "You did good, Jack," he said simply, clapping him on the shoulder. Jack looked at him, a hint of emotion in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, David. You've taught me more than you'll ever know." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Just remember, Jack, this is only the beginning. The real work is yet to come." And Jack knew, deep down, that David was right. The path ahead would be filled with challenges, setbacks, and difficult conversations. But he was ready. For the first time, he felt prepared to face whatever lay ahead, knowing he wasn't alone in his journey toward change. And as he left the building that evening, he felt a newfound sense of hope, a quiet, steady resolve that promised a brighter future, not just for him, but for all those who would come after. The next chapter in Jack's journey brought him back to the heart of the precinct, where his fellow officers awaited him with a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and silent judgment. Word had spread about his work with the task force, but within his own department, the reception had been divided. Some officers saw his commitment as genuine growth, while others perceived it as a betrayal, a public admission that they'd been in the wrong all along. The tension was palpable, every glance and whispered conversation adding weight to the growing divide. One morning, as Jack was reviewing materials for an upcoming workshop, a familiar figure appeared at his desk. It was Officer Karen Lee, someone Jack had worked alongside for years and who had always respected his judgment. But today, her expression was cautious, even conflicted. "Jack," she started, folding her arms and leaning against his desk. "You know, we used to look up to you around here. You were one of the best. People trusted your instincts." Her voice was tinged with frustration and hurt. "But now, well, a lot of us feel like you're turning your back on us." Jack looked at her, the weight of her words hitting him squarely. He took a deep breath before responding. "Karen, I haven't turned my back on anyone. If anything, I'm trying to make things better for all of us. The work I'm doing, this isn't about throwing anyone under the bus. It's about being honest with ourselves, understanding where we can improve." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, skepticism still lingering. "You really think all this training and self-reflection will change anything? We're cops, Jack. We're here to keep order, to protect people. You start questioning every instinct, every decision, and we'll lose that edge." Jack's gaze softened as he leaned forward, his tone quiet but firm. "Karen, what happened with David was a wake-up call. I thought I knew what protect and serve meant, but I was wrong. Protecting people isn't just about maintaining order. It's about treating people fairly, giving everyone the respect they deserve, whether they're sitting on a park bench or sitting in this precinct." Karen paused, her expression softening as Jack's words settled in. She nodded slowly, the beginnings of understanding flickering in her eyes. "Maybe you're right, Jack," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard for us to accept. Change isn't easy." Jack nodded, grateful for her honesty. "I get it, Karen. It's hard for me too. But we can't keep doing things the way we always have and expect trust to magically appear. We have to earn it, and that starts with us." As she left, Jack felt a surge of hope. He could see that the seeds of change were starting to take root, albeit slowly. But he also knew there was still a long way to go, and that for every officer like Karen willing to listen, there were others who remained staunchly resistant. A few days later, the precinct received news that left everyone on edge. A protest was scheduled for the weekend, organized by a coalition of activists calling for police reform. The tension in the precinct was thick, with officers voicing their opinions in passionate bursts. Some saw the protest as a threat, while others recognized it as an opportunity to listen, to engage with the community they served. Captain Morgan, determined to maintain order, gathered the entire team for a meeting. She stood at the front, her gaze moving steadily across the room. "This weekend," she began, her tone measured, "we have an opportunity to show this community what kind of officers we truly are. We will be present, we will be visible, and most importantly, we will remain professional." She glanced at Jack, a silent acknowledgement of the work he'd been doing. "Officer Rayner has been working with our task force on community engagement and de-escalation. He'll be taking point on our approach to this protest. I expect everyone to follow his lead." The announcement stirred a range of reactions, some supportive, others skeptical. Jack felt the pressure mounting, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself of everything he'd been working toward. This was his chance to put it all into action. When the day of the protest arrived, Jack was among the first officers on the scene, watching as people gathered, holding signs and chanting for justice. He could feel the energy in the air, a mix of anger, hope, and resilience. As he moved through the crowd, he noticed familiar faces, people from the community he'd seen countless times, but perhaps hadn't really looked at until now. At one point, he spotted David standing near the edge of the crowd, his presence calm but resolute. Their eyes met, and David gave him a small nod, a silent reminder of why he was there. Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose, a steady determination to get this right. As tensions rose, there were moments when it felt like things could spiral out of control. A few shouts from the crowd escalated, and some officers tensed, ready to respond. Jack quickly stepped in, his voice steady and reassuring as he reminded everyone to keep calm, to stay focused on their role as protectors, not enforcers. When a particularly vocal protester approached Jack, his voice filled with anger, Jack listened patiently, nodding, his posture open and respectful. "I hear you," he said calmly. "I understand your frustration, and we're here to listen. We're here to find a way forward, together." The protester, momentarily disarmed by Jack's response, paused, his anger softening into something more hopeful. "Then prove it," he said quietly, his eyes searching Jack's face for sincerity. "Prove that you're not just here to keep us in line." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of the man's words. "We're working on it," he replied, his voice filled with conviction. "It won't be perfect, and it won't be immediate. But we're here because we want things to change." As the protest continued, Jack and the other officers maintained a presence that was both strong and compassionate. They worked to keep the atmosphere peaceful, to show the crowd that they were there to protect, not intimidate. And when the protest eventually ended without incident, Jack felt a sense of relief and accomplishment, a small but significant step toward rebuilding trust. In the days that followed, news of the protests spread throughout the community and the precinct. People spoke about how the officers had handled themselves with respect, how they had listened rather than reacted. It was a story of hope, a rare moment of unity that had seemed impossible just months before. For Jack, the experience was a turning point. He realized that this work was about more than just policies or procedures. It was about connecting, about showing up, about proving that trust wasn't just a word but an action. He saw the impact of his efforts, both on the people he served and within the department. One evening, Captain Morgan called him in her office. She looked at him with an expression of quiet pride. "Jack," she began, "I've seen the work you've done. I know how hard it's been, how much you've given to this. I want you to know, it hasn't gone unnoticed." He nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Thank you, Captain. I couldn't have done it without your support, and without David's guidance." She gave him a slight smile, a rare expression from her. "David saw something in you that I think we all did, and I think deep down you saw it too. You just needed the right push." Jack felt the truth of her words, the realization that he had always had the potential for change, but had needed the right people, the right circumstances to bring it out. And as he left her office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to continue this path, not just for himself, but for everyone who had placed their trust in him. The following months brought new challenges, as Jack continued his work with the task force, reaching out to neighboring precincts, sharing what he'd learned. He encountered resistance, skepticism, and even open hostility at times, but he pressed forward, his resolve unshaken. With each conversation, Each workshop, he saw minds opening, perspectives shifting, however slowly. One day, during a panel discussion on police reform, Jack was asked a question that brought him back to the beginning of his journey. What would you say to the officer you were before all of this? The officer who thought he had it all figured out. Jack paused, the weight of the question settling over him. He thought back to the moment he'd first seen David in the park, the assumptions he'd made, the chain of events that had changed his life. Taking a deep breath, he looked out at the audience, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I would tell him to listen, he said slowly. To listen not just to the voices he agrees with, but to the ones that make him uncomfortable. To remember that every decision, every interaction, is an opportunity to either build trust or break it. And to understand that being a good officer isn't about always being right. It's about being willing to grow, to admit when you're wrong, and to work towards something better. The room was silent, the weight of his words resonating with everyone present. Jack felt a sense of closure, a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had faced his past and had come out stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. And as he left the stage that day, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he was no longer defined by his mistakes, but by the lessons he had learned, the people he had helped, and the path he was determined to continue. He was no longer just Officer Rayner. He was a bridge between worlds, a symbol of the change he'd once thought impossible, but now knew was within reach. As Jack's journey continued, he began to experience unexpected moments of connection with his community, small but meaningful interactions that had once been unimaginable. One chilly afternoon, he found himself walking through a local neighborhood, the streets bustling with families and friends enjoying the fresh air. Jack's presence no longer brought the wary glances it once had. Instead, people nodded to him in acknowledgement, some even offering a smile. It was a subtle change, but it carried a weight that Jack felt deeply. As he turned a corner, he noticed a group of kids playing basketball in a rundown park. They were laughing, shouting, their voices ringing out into the quiet of the neighborhood. Jack stopped, watching them for a moment, the scene tugging at something inside him. Just as he was about to move on, one of the kids, a young boy with a determined look in his eye, noticed Jack and waved him over. "Hey, officer," the boy called out, his voice bright. "Want to play?" Jack hesitated, caught off guard by the invitation. A few months ago, he would have waved it off, maybe even felt a touch of unease at interacting so openly. But things were different now. He walked over, hands in his pockets, a smile tugging at his lips. "You sure you want an old guy like me slowing down your game?" he asked, his tone light and teasing. The boy grinned, his eyes shining with excitement. "We can handle it," he replied, tossing Jack the ball. "Let's see what you've got." Laughter erupted from the kids as Jack attempted a layup, his form awkward but determined. The game was a lively mix of shouts, laughter, and friendly competition, with Jack quickly realizing he was no match for the energy and agility of the young players. But he didn't mind. This moment of pure connection, of feeling like a part of the community he had once distanced himself from, was worth every missed shot and every playful shove. After the game, as the kids sat on the park benches catching their breath, one of them looked up at Jack with curious eyes. "Hey, officer, why are you so different from the other cops?" The question hung in the air, and Jack felt a pang of both pride and sadness. He looked at the kids, their young faces open and hopeful, and he knew this was a moment that required honesty. "I wasn't always different," he admitted, his voice low. "There was a time when I didn't understand what I was doing, how my actions affected people. But I met someone who helped me see things differently, and now I'm trying to be better." The kids listened, their eyes wide with understanding. One of them, a girl with a quiet intensity, spoke up. "Well, I think you're doing a good job," she said simply, her words carrying a weight beyond her years. Jack smiled, gratitude filling his chest. "Thank you," he replied softly. "That means a lot." As he walked away from the park that day, Jack felt a newfound sense of purpose, a reminder that change was real, and it was happening in small, meaningful ways. He carried that moment with him, a symbol of the bridge he was building, not just with the community, but within himself. Back at the precinct, Captain Morgan had been keeping a close eye on Jack's progress. observing the shifts not only in his behavior, but also in the attitudes of those around him. Inspired by the impact Jack's transformation was having, she decided it was time to bring these changes to a broader scale. She called Jack into her office, her expression serious, but with a hint of anticipation. "Jack," she began, "you've come a long way. I don't think I've ever seen an officer adapt the way you have, and it's made me realize that what we're doing here has the potential to reach far beyond this precinct." Jack listened, intrigued, his curiosity piqued. "What are you thinking, Captain?" She leaned forward, her eyes sharp with determination. "I'm thinking it's time we take this task force citywide. The work you've done, the relationships you've built, they're proof that we can change, that we can rebuild trust. But I need someone to lead this effort, someone who can show other precincts that change is not only possible, but necessary." Jack's eyes widened, the weight of her words settling over him. He felt a surge of both excitement and responsibility, the magnitude of the opportunity dawning on him. You want me to lead this?" Captain Morgan nodded, her expression unwavering. "Yes, Jack. I want you to head up the citywide task force. I believe you're the one who can make this happen, who can take what you've learned and bring it to officers across the city. But only if you're willing." Jack took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was more than he had ever imagined, a chance to make a difference on a scale he'd never thought possible. He looked at Captain Morgan, feeling the gravity of her trust in him, and nodded. "I'm ready, Captain. Let's do this." The following months were a whirlwind of activity, as Jack threw himself into his new role, coordinating workshops, organizing community meetings, and speaking with officers from precincts all over the city. His work was met with a mix of enthusiasm and resistance, but Jack had grown resilient, his conviction unshaken even in the face of opposition. One day, Jack was preparing for a panel discussion on police reform when he received an unexpected visitor, David Grant. Dressed in his usual composed manner, David offered Jack a warm smile as he approached. "David," Jack greeted him, surprised but pleased. "What brings you here?" David's eyes twinkled with a hint of amusement. "I thought I'd come by and see how the man I inspired is holding up," he replied, his tone light. "Word has it you're quite the leader now." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "I wouldn't be here without you, David. You've taught me more than you realize." David's expression softened, a rare hint of emotion in his usually composed demeanor. "And you've shown me that people can change, Jack. That's no small thing." As they stood there, side by side, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for David's guidance, but for the unlikely friendship they had forged. They were two men from different worlds, brought together by a single moment that had changed both of their lives. "Jack," David continued, his voice quieter, "I want you to know that what you're doing, it matters. Not just to the people in this city, but to people everywhere who are looking for hope, for proof that change is possible. You're giving them that proof." Jack nodded, the weight of David's words filling him with both pride and responsibility. "Thank you, David. I won't let you down." David offered a final nod, his expression one of quiet respect. "I know you won't." That evening, Jack found himself reflecting on the journey he'd taken, the lessons he'd learned, and the man he'd become. He thought back to the person he'd been before, the officer who had thought he knew everything, who had believed that his instincts were beyond question. That man was still a part of him, but he had been transformed, molded by the challenges he'd faced and the people who had guided him along the way. And as Jack looked out over the city he had sworn to protect, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the path ahead would be long and difficult, filled with moments of doubt and struggle. But he was ready. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to serve, not with authority, but with compassion, humility, and the willingness to listen. The city lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of the countless lives he was working to impact, the people he was fighting to protect and uplift. Jack took a deep breath, his gaze steady, his heart resolute. This was his mission now, to be a bridge between the people and the force, to show others that change wasn't just a dream, but a choice, a journey, a commitment. And as he stepped forward into the night, Jack Rayner knew that he was no longer just an officer. He was a man on a mission, a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of redemption and the strength of the human spirit. The journey was far from over, but Jack was ready, determined to see it through to the end. One step, one change, one connection at a time. Jack's role in the task force soon brought him face to face with challenges he hadn't anticipated. While he was committed to the mission, the resistance he encountered was stronger than ever. Officers who felt threatened by the changes took to quiet muttering, questioning Jack's loyalty to the force. Some senior officers even tried to undermine his efforts, dismissing the task force as unnecessary and disruptive. Every step forward felt hard-won, every victory shadowed by the subtle yet persistent resistance from those who feared change. One afternoon, as Jack prepared to lead a workshop on implicit bias for a group of officers, he overheard two of them in the hallway. They were speaking just loud enough for him to hear, their tone mocking. "Since when did Jack become a social worker?" One of them said, snickering. "Maybe he forgot that our job is to catch criminals, not coddle them." The other laughed. "Guess he's too busy trying to impress his new community friends to remember what the badge actually stands for." Jack felt a surge of anger, but took a steadying breath, reminding himself of why he was here. This wasn't about proving himself to them. It was about pushing forward, no matter how hard the journey got. He squared his shoulders and entered the room, setting up for the workshop as if he hadn't heard a thing. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at him. After the session, as the officers filed out, one younger officer, Maya Ortiz, lingered behind. She had been attentive throughout the workshop, her gaze sharp and focused, and as she approached Jack, there was a spark of understanding in her eyes. "Officer Rayner," she began hesitantly, her voice quiet but steady, "I just wanted to say thank you. All of this means a lot. I know you're getting pushback, but I just wanted you to know that there are some of us who appreciate what you're doing." Her words struck a chord, washing over Jack like a balm. He gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Officer Ortiz. That means more than you know." She nodded, her eyes earnest. "I joined the force because I wanted to help people, but it's easy to forget that when you're told, over and over, that showing empathy makes you weak. Your example, it's a reminder of what we can be, not just what we are." Jack felt a swell of pride, his resolve strengthening. "Keep that fire, Maya. Change isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight, but every little step we take matters. You're part of that change." With a final nod, she left, and Jack stood there for a moment, the encounter reminding him that even in the darkest moments, there were others willing to fight beside him. It gave him the strength he needed to keep going, to press on despite the doubt, the resistance, and the weight of expectation. Several weeks later, Jack received an invitation to speak at a citywide forum on police reform. The invitation was unexpected, but presented an opportunity to address the public directly. It was a chance for him to speak not only about the changes within the force, but also about his own journey, a story of accountability, growth, and redemption. But with that opportunity came a sense of vulnerability, a reminder that he'd be standing before a crowd of skeptics, some of whom might view him as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. On the night of the forum, the auditorium was packed. Jack stood backstage, pacing as he rehearsed his speech in his head. Just as he was about to step on stage, a familiar figure appeared beside him, David Grant, looking calm and composed as always. Jack couldn't hide his surprise. "David," he said, his voice low but filled with relief. "I didn't know you'd be here." David offered a small smile, his gaze steady. "I thought you might need a friendly face in the crowd. Besides, I wanted to see this moment." Jack felt a surge of gratitude, his nerves easing slightly. "Thanks, David. I'm not sure how this is going to go, but I know I need to say these things. It's time." David nodded, his expression encouraging. "Just speak from the heart, Jack. People can feel authenticity. Don't be afraid to let them see who you really are." With those words, Jack took a deep breath, gathering his courage, and stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, and the audience was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on him. He took a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle over him before he began. "Good evening," he started, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Officer Jack Rayner, and I'm here tonight to talk about my journey. one that has taken me from a place of certainty and authority to a place of questioning, humility, and growth. He paused, letting his words sink in, feeling the tension in the room shift. A few months ago, I was forced to confront a part of myself I hadn't wanted to see. I thought I was doing my job, following my instincts, but I realized that sometimes those instincts are colored by things we don't want to admit. Assumptions, biases, fear. And I learned that those things can lead to actions that hurt people, actions that break trust, actions that go against everything I believed I stood for. There was a ripple of murmurs in the crowd, but Jack pressed on, his voice growing stronger. Tonight, I'm not here to preach. I'm here to share. I want to tell you that change is hard, harder than I ever imagined. But it's also possible. I've seen it in myself, and I've seen it in others. It's not easy. It's not fast, but it's real. And it starts with each of us being willing to look in the mirror, to hold ourselves accountable, and to take responsibility. Jack paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience, taking in the mix of skepticism, curiosity, and hope on their faces. I know some of you might not believe in me yet. I know trust isn't rebuilt with words alone, but I'm committed to earning it, to showing you that there are officers who care, who want to bridge the gap, who are willing to do the work. A slow, tentative applause began, growing in momentum as more people joined in. Jack felt a rush of relief and humility, a reminder that even the smallest acknowledgement of his efforts meant something. When he stepped off the stage, David was waiting, his eyes filled with pride. "You did well, Jack," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You reached them." Jack nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and purpose. "I hope so, David. I really hope so." In the weeks that followed, Jack's speech became a talking point across the city. People from all walks of life reached out, some to thank him, others to share their stories, and some still skeptical, but willing to give him a chance. The task force gained momentum, with more officers volunteering to join, inspired by Jack's honesty and commitment. Even the precinct, once divided on the topic of reform, began to show signs of unity, the resistance giving way to cautious optimism. One day, Captain Morgan called Jack in her office. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen before, one of pride and respect. "Jack," she began, her voice carrying a warmth that felt like an embrace, "you've done something remarkable. You've shown this city and this department that we can be better, that we can change. You're not just an officer anymore. You're a leader." Jack felt a swell of emotion, humbled by her words. "Thank you, Captain. I couldn't have done any of this without your support." She gave him a small smile, her gaze unwavering. "We need more leaders like you, Jack. People willing to take risks, to be vulnerable, to show strength through honesty. And I'm proud to have you here, to have you leading this charge." As he left her office, Jack knew that his journey was still unfolding, that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and setbacks. But he was no longer alone, no longer carrying the weight of doubt and guilt. He had a mission, a team, and a city that was ready to believe in him, if he proved worthy of their trust. In the days that followed, Jack continued his work with a renewed sense of determination. He led workshops, spoke at schools, visited communities, and built relationships that once seemed impossible. And with each connection, each story, he felt the bridge he'd been building grow stronger, more resilient. Jack Rayner was no longer just an officer on a redemption arc. He was a symbol of what could be. And as he looked out over the city he had once patrolled with a detached sense of authority, he saw it now with new eyes, with understanding, compassion, and a fierce commitment to protect it not just with his badge, but with his heart. As Jack pressed forward with his work, he found himself invited to speak at a conference for police reform advocates and law enforcement professionals alike. The event was high profile, attracting community leaders, activists, and officials from around the country, all gathered to discuss the future of policing. Jack knew this would be one of his biggest challenges yet. The room would be filled with people on all sides, some hopeful, others hardened skeptics, and even those who openly doubted the possibility of meaningful change. The conference hall buzzed with anticipation as Jack prepared his remarks, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. Standing backstage, he could hear the murmur of voices, feel the tension and energy as people debated, exchanged opinions, and waited for answers. For the first time in a while, Jack felt a flicker of anxiety, a reminder of just how high the stakes were. He was about to address a room filled with people whose lives and work had been shaped by their experiences with the justice system, and many of them had endured the kind of trauma he had only recently begun to understand. As he took a deep breath, someone approached him, a young woman with a notebook, her face familiar. Jack recognized her as Sarah Thompson, an investigative journalist who had followed his story and the task force's efforts closely. She had a reputation for cutting through platitudes and holding public figures accountable, and Jack knew she wasn't here for pleasantries. "Officer Rayner," she greeted him with a small nod. "I'm glad I caught you before you went on stage. I just wanted to ask, do you really believe you're making a difference? Or is this just another public relations campaign?" Jack looked at her, sensing the sharp edge in her question, but also the genuine curiosity beneath it. He respected Sarah's directness, and he knew that the answer she wanted wasn't a rehearsed statement, but something real. "Yes, Sarah," he replied, meeting her gaze. "I believe I'm making a difference, but not because it's easy or because everyone's on board. I believe it because I see the way people are responding, not just in words but in actions. There are officers who are willing to change, communities willing to trust us again, and that's not something you can fake." Sarah's expression softened, if only slightly. "I'll be watching, Officer Rayner," she said, closing her notebook. "I'll be watching to see if this is real." As she walked away, Jack felt a renewed sense of determination. He was not here to convince everyone in one speech or win everyone over with words. He was here to share his truth, to reach those who were ready to listen, and to plant a seed that he hoped would grow long after he left the stage. When he finally stepped out, the audience fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. Jack took a moment to let his gaze sweep across the crowd, noting the guarded faces, the hopeful eyes, the skeptical frowns. He felt a strange calm settle over him, a steady resolve to say what needed to be said. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying across the room with quiet strength. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers. I'm here to share my story, a story of learning, of failure, and of growth. Because I believe that if we are to change policing, we must first change ourselves." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "A year ago, I was a different man. I believed that my instincts were enough, that I could judge a situation at a glance. I was wrong. I met someone who challenged me, someone who held up a mirror to my actions, and I saw things I hadn't wanted to see. It was uncomfortable. It was painful, but it was necessary." As he spoke, the room grew even quieter, the crowd's attention sharpening. Jack felt a surge of courage, knowing this was the moment to let his guard down. "It's easy to talk about accountability," he continued, "but it's much harder to practice it. I had to ask myself hard questions. Was I serving people, or was I controlling them? Was I building trust, or was I breaking it? And I realized that true policing isn't about power or authority. It's about protection. It's about being willing to listen, to let people tell their stories, to see them as more than statistics or profiles." A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd, and Jack could feel their engagement, a sense of unity forming as he laid bare his journey. He went on, speaking about the changes the task force had implemented, the workshops, the community events, and the relationships he'd built. He shared stories of people who had once distrusted him, but had since found common ground, moments of humility and humanity that had reshaped his understanding of service. "But change isn't easy," he acknowledged, his voice dropping slightly. "There are still days when I question myself, when I wonder if I'm strong enough to keep pushing forward. But every time I see a spark of understanding, a moment of connection, like the one I had with the kids at the basketball court, or with a fellow officer who once resisted this very work, I remember why I'm here. We're all part of this community, and if we can't protect each other, if we can't show respect and compassion, then what are we fighting for?" Jack's words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those who listened. As he looked out, he could see faces softening, expressions shifting as people began to see him not just as an officer, but as a person who had struggled, learned, and changed. As he finished, the audience erupted in applause. Not the polite kind, but the genuine, thunderous applause that comes from shared understanding and respect. Jack felt a swell of relief, pride, and hope, knowing that he had reached them in a way he hadn't thought possible. After he stepped down, a steady stream of people approached him, each wanting to share a story, a word of thanks, or simply a handshake. He took the time to listen to each of them, feeling the impact of his words in every interaction, every grateful smile, every tear-filled eye. When he finally reached the lobby, he found David waiting for him. His friend's face held a look of approval, a rare and genuine warmth. "Not bad, Jack," David said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Not bad at all." Jack chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "Thanks, David. I didn't think I'd make it through, to be honest." David's smile widened, a touch of humor in his gaze. "You've come a long way from that stubborn officer who thought he had nothing to learn." Jack laughed, shaking his head. "That feels like a lifetime ago. I just hope I'm doing enough." David's expression softened, his voice quiet but firm. "Jack, you're doing more than enough. You're giving people hope. You're giving them something to believe in." As they stood together, Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude for David's friendship, for the way this journey had brought them closer, had forged a bond of mutual respect and trust. In that moment, he realized that he was no longer walking this path alone. He had allies, supporters, and friends who shared his vision. And as they left the conference hall, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose, a promise to himself to continue this work, to build the bridges that had once seemed impossible. The road ahead was still long, but he was ready to face it, knowing that he was not only making a difference, but also inspiring others to do the same. The city was changing one step at a time, and Jack Rayner was at the heart of it. No longer just an officer, but a leader, a friend, and a beacon of hope for a community ready to believe in a better future. After the conference, Jack felt a new surge of energy and commitment, but he was also keenly aware that real, lasting change would take time. He could see the slow but steady progress in the officers he trained, the community members he spoke with, and even in himself. However, he also sensed that he was nearing a turning point, a moment that would either cement or undo all the progress he'd made. One evening, as Jack was catching up on paperwork in the precinct, Captain Morgan called him into her office. She looked more serious than usual, her gaze fixed as she invited him to sit. "Jack," she began, "I just received a call. There's been an incident in Eastwood, a part of the city known for tensions between residents and the police. It seems that a patrol team, led by Officer Michael Connors, had an altercation with some local residents. Things escalated, and it's turned into a standoff." Jack felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Eastwood was notorious for its mistrust of the police. If things had reached a standoff, it meant there was real danger of the situation spiraling out of control. "Why tell me, Captain?" he asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. Captain Morgan met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I'm asking you to go there, Jack. To be a voice of reason, a mediator. You're the only one who can calm things down without making people feel threatened." Jack's mind raced, weighing the risks and the responsibility. He'd spent months building trust, showing people that change was possible, but this was real. This was a test of everything he'd learned, every lesson he'd absorbed. "I'll go," he said, his voice firm. "But I need someone there who understands the community, who can speak their language." Captain Morgan nodded, as if anticipating his response. "I've already reached out to David. He agreed to meet you there. The two of you can work together to defuse the situation." Hearing David's name brought a sense of relief, a reminder that he wasn't in this alone. Together, they had the strength and understanding to bridge divides, to bring calm where others might bring chaos. The scene at Eastwood was tense, with a crowd gathered near the apartment complex where the altercation had occurred. The air buzzed with tension and frustration, voices raised as residents called out grievances and accusations. A line of officers stood on the other side, some with their hands resting on their belts, their postures guarded. Jack spotted David near the edge of the crowd, his calm presence a steadying force amidst the rising tension. Jack made his way over, and David greeted him with a nod, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Glad you're here, Jack," he said. "It's bad. Officer Connors and his team handled things poorly. The residents are feeling cornered, and the officers are too tense to back down." Jack nodded, his mind working quickly to assess the situation. He took a deep breath and looked at David. "Let's split up. I'll talk to the officers. You speak with the residents. We'll try to meet in the middle." David gave him a look of approval, the silent understanding between them stronger than words. They both knew that this was more than a standoff. It was a moment to prove that empathy and communication could diffuse even the most volatile situations. As Jack approached the officers, he noticed Connors, his expression taut, frustration radiating from his stance. Jack could see that Connors was both angry and defensive, a combination that only added fuel to the fire. "Connors," Jack called out, keeping his tone steady but firm. "I need to talk to you for a second." Connors turned, his face hardening when he saw Jack. "Raynor," he replied tersely. "What are you doing here?" Jack held his gaze, refusing to let Connors' hostility deter him. "I'm here to help calm things down," he said. "I know tensions are high, but the last thing we need is to escalate this. Let's work together to bring the crowd down." Connors scoffed, crossing his arms. "Easy for you to say. These people don't listen to us. They don't respect the law. Why should we back down?" Jack felt a surge of frustration, but kept his tone calm. "Because, Connors, respect goes both ways. We need to show them that we're here to protect, not provoke. We're not here to win. We're here to keep the peace." Connors' jaw tightened, his pride clearly stung, but Jack could see a glimmer of hesitation. "Fine," he muttered. "What do you suggest?" Jack glanced over his shoulder, watching as David spoke with the crowd, his calm voice and steady gestures already making a visible impact. "Let me and David handle this. Stand down. Let the crowd see we're not trying to push them back. Sometimes, all people need is to feel heard." Connors looked conflicted, but he finally nodded, stepping back with a reluctant sigh. Jack took a deep breath, relief washing over him as he turned to join David. Meanwhile, David was in deep conversation with a few of the community leaders, including an older man named Mr. Thompson, who had a strong influence over the neighborhood. Mr. Thompson was a retired teacher, respected by residents and known for his firm but fair approach to community matters. "David," Mr. Thompson said, his voice carrying a mix of frustration and weariness. "I've lived here my whole life. We've dealt with police coming in here like they own the place, treating us like criminals in our own homes. It's hard to believe this time is any different." David placed a hand on Mr. Thompson's shoulder, his voice gentle but earnest. "I understand, sir. And you're right. Things have gone wrong too many times. But this time, we're not here to fight. We're here to listen, to understand." Mr. Thompson studied him, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Words are easy, David. But action, that's what we need to see."